Everyone. So this is lecture 6 for invasion ecology, talking about a unifying framework for invasion ecology. And the accompanying reading is Catford et al. From 2009 on reducing redundancy. And I hope you enjoy going through all of the various tables and figures in there. There's lots of information in this, this great paper. So we've talked in class about propagal pressure, which is at the top of this table, which, as you'll see, if you haven't already, this table goes on for 4 or 5 pages, so lots of hypotheses. We've talked about propagal pressure. We've talked about enemy release. We've talked about empty niche. You've just finished in your team exercise looking at invader traits. So that's 4 hypotheses that we've talked about. And Catford here present 29 hypotheses. So that means that you've got 25 more that we haven't talked about in class. And some of these we will not really have a chance to talk about. There are a lot of hypotheses that have been presented in invasion ecology. The Catford paper is from 2009. There was a more recent update of this in 2020, and where they tried to do something similar of putting hypotheses together in these clusters. And in this case, they had 39 different hypotheses. So we went from 29 in Catford to 39 in the Enders paper. We are just adding more and more ideas of potentially why invasive species get introduced, established, spread, and have impacts. So the framing behind Catford is this idea that we've got lots and lots of these individual hypotheses that people have put together that often focus on a single invasive species or a single invaded community, or, you know, these sort of niche, I guess, components of ecology. And ecology is super complex. Invasion ecology, similarly, super complex. And so, you know, scientists always want to try to explain their system, their focal species, and sometimes coming up with a new hypothesis for what might affect that species, what might have caused that particular species to become invasive in this particular community. That's something that we're always trying to understand. But the net result, because there's lots of different invasive species and lots of different invaded communities, is that we have all of these kind of isolated mechanisms that we're describing of how species go on to be introduced, established, spread, and have impact. When, if we want to understand invasion ecology writ large, we need to take a step back and have more of a broader framework of the components that go into those different hypotheses. And so that's what Catford is proposing in this paper. And what she says is that there are 3, I guess, in this sort of PAB framework, 3 main components, but the B is broken down into 2 different things. So really it's 4 components. And then when she's talking about it, there's also this sort of human interaction, kind of interacting with all of those. So really it could be 5 different components if you add the human to the exterior of that. So we've got propagal pressure. We have abiotic characteristics, and this is going to be of the recipient ecosystem. So what's the climate like, stuff like that. We have biotic characteristics of 2 things, of the invasive species, so that's invader traits, and of the recipient ecosystem. So what the community looks like that invasive species is moving into. So propagal pressure include things like the volume of introduction, how many propagals were introduced to an area, how frequently they were introduced, how many times they were introduced. We often don't have information. We've talked about this before when you talked about propagal pressure. We often don't have this type of information because it happened long ago, or maybe not that long ago, but it's still in the past. And so it's not an easy metric to go back and collect. So instead we use proxies a lot of time for propagal pressure. So proxies include things like the volume of trade between countries, the volume of a particular commodity. For example, if we are looking specifically at wood-boring insects, we might look at the volume of trade in goods basically that would be shipped over on shipping pallets that have wood that those insects would bore into. Abiotic characteristics include the physical environment of the recipient ecosystem. So the climate conditions, the type of soil, other geographic phenomenon, like how easy it might be to disperse through an area because of the geography, if there are major barriers in that area, the topography, so, you know, including aspect, things like that, north facing, south facing, anything that would prevent or allow for a species to persist and spread within an area that doesn't include directly the biological component of it. Because that's the next one, the biotic characteristics. So biotic characteristics are two things. First, this BI, which is the invader traits. So those could include invasive species advantages. So novel weapons is one hypothesis for this that deals a lot of times with plants that are brought over that have allelopathy. So allelopathy refers to chemicals that are exuded from the roots of a species of a plant that are basically designed to kill off other plant roots, right? So it's a competitive advantage. And if other plants in the recipient community, if they have not evolved to combat these new chemicals in the soil, then that could be a big advantage of the invasive species. But other invader traits are those things like, you know, growth rate, fecundity, just the kind of basic traits of a species that could promote introduction, establishment, spread, and impact, right? All of those different pieces along the pathway of invasion. And then the other half of the B is the traits of the recipient ecosystem. One of the biggest things that gets measured and tested for biotic traits of the recipient ecosystems is something called biotic resistance. So this question of if you have higher diversity in your native ecosystem, are you likely to resist the invasion? And there are lots of other questions about how the invader and the invaded community are interacting and whether that could help or hinder an invasion. So Catford is saying, okay, there's these 4 different components, and the question that we don't know the answer to, we didn't know the answer to when Catford put this together in 2009, we still don't know the answer to this question, is, okay, which of these components is most important for invasion? Is it the propagal pressure, as Ecology hypothesized, that we should just look at propagal pressure and see if that's actually the cause of all of these invasions? Is it because the abiotic conditions are right, climate is perfect, and therefore the invasion is going to happen? Is it because of invader traits on the biological side? Is it because of some susceptibility of the invaded community also on the biological side? And then you have this H kind of with a whole bunch of arrows going into this, and that's the human component, right? So is it because we have disturbed these biological communities? Is it because we are changing the abiotic conditions like climate change and other forms of global change, fertilizing the world? Is it because we are just introducing tons of these things, so the human component to propagal pressure? And if you kind of look through that list, and one of the Catford tables does a really nice job of kind of putting little pluses next to the hypotheses that are testing one or more of these components of the propagal pressure, abiotic and biotic. If you look at all of those, then you see that there is a little bit of research focused on propagal pressure. There's a little bit of research, I shouldn't say a little bit, there's a decent amount of research focused on propagal pressure and a decent amount focused on abiotic conditions. And there's a lot of research focused on the two biotic components, whether that's the traits of the invasive species or traits of the recipient community. But when you look across and try to find hypotheses or research that goes across all four of these components, that center of the Venn diagram, you don't see a whole lot of research in that area. And so that means that we have a hard time trying to understand, well, which of all of these different things is most important for invasion. And our lack of understanding of what's most important for invasion is really important when we think about this from a management standpoint, right? So we have propagal pressure first, if the species never arrives, we don't have to worry about all these things. We have the traits of the invading species that are going to be affected by each of those different pieces along the invasion pathway. So traits that would allow for more propagules to be introduced, traits that would allow a species to establish effectively, traits that would allow a species to spread, traits that would allow a species to have high impact, abiotic conditions, the biotic conditions, right? So all of these are kind of nested into each other in terms of which of these factors is the most important for invasion. So on the left side, we've got a case where I just put some percentages next to these. Let's say on the whole, if we knew all this information about every invasive species that was out there in every recipient community, let's say on the whole, half of our prediction of what becomes invasive is attributed directly to propagal pressure, frequency and amount of introductions. 40% is associated with whether that species can survive, establish, spread, and have impact. And then, the abiotic and biotic components are not as important. If that were the case, then from a management standpoint, overall, in terms of reducing invasions around the world, we would mostly want to focus on import pathways, right? And reducing the numbers of those potentially high impact invasive species based on their traits. But it could be that it's completely the opposite. It could be that propagal pressure matters a little, traits matter a little, but really what's important is having good characteristics of the recipient environment. It's all about the recipient ecosystems, the abiotic characteristics, and the biotic characteristics. If that was the case, writ large for invasion ecology, then we would want to spend all of our management dollars and time focusing on supporting resilience to invasion, on restoring disturbance, really focused on those recipient ecosystems, because it's the traits of those that are causing species to invade. And we don't know what the proportion is of all of these things. It very likely varies by taxonomic group. It may vary based on geography. Lots of things could affect which of these different components is most important, but we just don't know the answer because so rarely do we end up with anything down here, right? Not too much that's measuring all of those different components together so that we could actually quantify, okay, it's mostly propagal pressure or it's mostly biotic or abiotic. So Catford proposed an experimental setup to test invader success, basically to try to break apart the propagal pressure from the abiotic, from the invader traits, from the recipient community traits. And so that would entail something like putting different numbers of invasive species. So that's the propagal pressure. So put a couple, put a lot, into different native community assemblages. So that's the biotic conditions of the recipient community, this community R, S, or T. Do that for different invasive species. So you can't just do that for one. You'd need to do it for a bunch of different invasive species that had different traits. And you'd want to do that across a gradient of abiotic conditions. So that's this habitat 1, habitat 2, habitat 3. So what they're basically saying is we need to stratify the heck out of everything. So have a gradient of invader traits, a gradient of propagal density, a gradient of biological communities across a gradient of abiotic conditions. The problem is that this requires some seriously large-scale experiments to try to test all of these different components in a reasonable way, which means that it's really, really expensive, therefore hard to fund and also hard to do. And even in this particular setup, in this diagram, we're still only testing 2 invasive species with 2 propagal densities across 3 communities and 3 abiotic conditions. So it's still not even going to get us to the point of, well, for any given invasive species, which of these things matter? This would only tell us for, again, a small sample. So part of the reason why you end up with these tables with lots of different hypotheses in them is because it's very hard to test a unifying framework, because there are so many different invasive species in so many recipient habitats across so many different abiotic conditions that have been introduced with different varieties of propagal pressure in the past that we don't really know about. So for your next team exercise, you're going to be digging into a few more of these hypotheses that Catford is presenting in Table 2. You're going to learn more about them. So you're going to look up some of these key references, try to figure out who's tested them, on what kind of taxa have they tested them. And then you're going to teach us about that hypothesis and whether you think, you know, it's pretty broadly applicable or maybe more narrowly applicable. And just as a reminder, the reading associated with this lecture is the Catford paper, so make sure that you take a look through that and find the quiz questions on Moodle. I love this paper, so I hope you will enjoy it too.